So imagine you were just driving to work on a random, totally unremarkable Tuesday.
Right, just a normal day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Traffic is light, your mind is on, the morning meeting, and then a specific song comes on the radio. Or maybe a pedestrian crosses in front of your car wearing this very particular familiar jacket.
Oh, I know where this is going.
Right. Because in a fraction of a second, before you even consciously register what is happening, your nervous system is entirely hijacked.
Completely taken over.
Yes. Your chest tightens. Your stomach drops. You are suddenly flooded with this vivid, overwhelming memory of an ex-partner from, like, 5 years ago. And it is not just a passing nostalgic thought, is it?
No, it's really not. It's a full-body physiological response.
Exactly. So you spend the rest of the morning utterly disoriented, sitting at your desk wondering why your brain insists on dragging you backward. Why are you suddenly craving the presence of someone you mathematically, logically know was a disastrous match for you?
It's awful because it really feels like a betrayal by your own biology. I mean, we expect our minds to protect us from recognized threats, right?
Yeah, you'd think so.
But here's the brain serving up this deeply evocative, painful highlight reel of a closed chapter, demanding you feel it all over again.
And when people experience that biological betrayal, they usually turn to the internet for answers. I mean, they log onto social media and just get bombarded with pop psychology tropes.
Oh, the TikTok algorithms are brutal for this.
So brutal. They hand you these incredibly rigid, cartoonish narratives about, narcissistic exes, or these absolute biological mandates about how men and women process grief, or like some 5-step checklist to achieve closure.
Which is rarely how human psychology actually works.
Right. So today, we are pushing all of that algorithm-driven noise completely off the table. Welcome to today's Deep Dive, where we have a massive stack of clinical research, longitudinal behavioral data, and neuroimaging studies that map out the literal mechanics of post-breakup processing.
It's some of the most fascinating stuff we've ever looked at.
It really is. The mission for our deep dive today is to understand the absolute bedrock of what is happening inside your head when a past love haunts the present. So let's just jump right in. What is the core idea here?
Well, the foundational thesis that upends everything we assume about heartbreak is simply this. Human memory is not an archive.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
I mean, it is not a hard drive where video files sit perfectly preserved in a folder, waiting to be double-clicked and played back with objective fidelity.
So we aren't just hitting play on a factual recording.
Not at all. Your memory of a past relationship is a continuously curated, heavily edited mental construction. And the editing process is driven almost entirely by your present-day emotional architecture, not by the historical reality of the partnership.
Okay, let's unpack this hardware a bit. Let's look at the actual neurological hardware running that editing software. Because if I remember a Tuesday from 3 years ago when my ex and I fought about, a recurring issue, I assume I am retrieving a factual record of that exact event.
Which is a very logical assumption to make.
Right. But the neuroscience sources point to this mechanism called reconsolidation, which basically suggests the mere act of remembering destroys the objectivity of the memory.
Exactly. Reconsolidation is really the great vulnerability of human cognition.
And how does it actually work?
So, when an experience is initially encoded in the brain, it forms a specific neural pathway. Now, the classical view was that once the memory consolidated, it was permanent, done.
Like it was carved in stone.
Right. But the modern neuroscientific reality is far more fluid. When you recall a memory, when you pull it out of the vault into your active working memory, that neural pathway becomes physically unlocked. It enters a state of plasticity.
Wow, so it's basically vulnerable again.
Highly vulnerable. During this window, the memory is literally unspooled and subject to interference. Your current biological state, your circulating cortisol levels, your immediate environmental cues, and your current emotional needs all actively bind to that unlocked memory.
So it's akin to opening a Wikipedia page. Like every time I hit refresh, a different editor, who's still me, but, me operating under the influence of today's exhaustion or today's loneliness, goes in and tweaks the text.
That is a brilliant analogy, yes.
I might delete an entire paragraph detailing a chronic boundary violation, and instead, I just bold the sentence about how they bought me flowers once. And when I close the page, it saves those edits as the new foundational truth.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic bias of that internal editor. Because if you are experiencing acute isolation on that random Tuesday commute we talked about, your internal editor is desperate for a neurochemical soothing agent.
It just wants to feel better.
Exactly. It opens the file of the past relationship, highlights the warmest, most validating moments, and deliberately downplays the structural toxicity.
Just to get that fix.
Right. And when the memory undergoes reconsolidation, when it locks back into the vault, it has been physically overwritten. It is saved with this new, idealized emotional halo.
So you are quite literally remembering a fiction that you just authored to soothe the present ache.
Yes, you are authoring a functional fiction.
That is mind-blowing. And the research indicates this selective editing isn't arbitrary at all, right? It's dictated by the tension between two specific structures in the brain.
Yes, the amygdala and the hippocampus.
The emotional alarm system versus the context file clerk.
I love that. Yes, the architecture of those two structures dictates the entire trajectory of your grief.
So break them down for us. What does the amygdala do?
The amygdala is tasked entirely with survival. It scans the environment for high-stakes information and tags it with massive emotional intensity.
Okay, threat detector.
A threat detector, but also a safety detector. It takes this biochemical highlighter and marks moments of intense relational safety, euphoric connection, or, on the flip side, acute betrayal. It flags those moments as critical data for your future survival.
Okay, so it highlights the big feelings. What about the hippocampus?
The hippocampus is responsible for the boring contextual metadata. You know, the date, the time, the nuanced dialogue leading up to an argument, the daily grind of incompatible living habits.
The fine print of the relationship.
Exactly, the fine print. But the problem is that the hippocampus is a terrible archivist long-term.
Right, while the amygdala never forgets a feeling.
Never. The contextual data encoded by the hippocampus undergoes this rapid neurobiological decay. The daily friction, the subtle disrespect, the realization that you had fundamentally divergent worldviews, all that nuance just erodes.
It fades away.
But the emotional valence tagged by the amygdala remains fiercely intact. It's totally insulated against time. The conceptual feeling of the connection survives long after the structural reasons for its failure have evaporated from your conscious recall.
Well, that explains the paralyzing cognitive dissonance people feel.
Yeah.
I mean, you can sit with a journal and rationally list the ways a partner diminished your life. You can mathematically prove the relationship was unviable.
You can have a whole spreadsheet of why they were bad for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yet, the hippocampus has dropped the contextual files,
Right.
and the amygdala is just flashing this massive neon sign that says, we experienced profound safety with this organism in 2021. Reacquire.
Reacquire at all costs, yes.
It also really explains why the pain of that absence isn't just a metaphor. The fMRI data in these clinical studies on heartbreak is staggering.
It's some of the most compelling imaging data in relational psychology.
Can you walk us through what they found?
Sure. So when researchers place individuals who have recently endured an unwanted romantic separation into a functional MRI scanner, and then they expose them to photographs of their former partners, we don't merely see activation in the memory centers.
Or just the emotional processing hubs, right?
Right. What's fascinating here is that the secondary somatosensory cortex and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex light up with intense metabolic activity.
And for anyone who isn't a neuroscientist, those regions govern the acute perception of physical tissue damage.
Yes. Searing bodily trauma.
Wait, really? So the brain thinks you're physically hurt?
The neural circuitry literally cannot distinguish between the social rejection of a breakup and the physical trauma of touching a hot stove or breaking a femur.
That is wild. I mean, we use the word heartbreak poetically, but evolutionarily, social isolation was a literal death sentence.
Absolutely. A
Yeah.
hominid separated from the tribe on the savannah simply didn't survive the night.
So it makes total sense that evolution wouldn't bother building a bespoke, separate sadness alarm system. It just hijacked the existing physical pain matrix to force the organism to seek reconnection at all costs.
It's a brilliant evolutionary shortcut, but of course it causes immense suffering in the modern era. Your brain is signaling a catastrophic threat to your biological survival over someone who just, didn't text you back.
Right. Which brings us to the concept of cognitive load, because the brain is already treating the loss as a physical wound.
Yes, and that takes a ton of energy.
And if you add high present-day cognitive load to that, like a demanding career, financial stress, chronic sleep deprivation, or just a general sense of contemporary alienation, the brain's resources are entirely depleted.
They are tapped out. because high-level executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex requires immense metabolic energy.
To do the logical reasoning, you mean?
Exactly. When depleted, the brain defaults to automated, low-energy, soothe and seek behaviors. It scans the historical database for the fastest available hit of dopamine and oxytocin.
So it just retrieves the bright spots of the past relationship to act as an immediate emotional salve.
Precisely. It filters out the complex incompatibilities because processing that kind of complexity is metabolically expensive and you're already exhausted.
So you come home from a brutal day, your boss humiliated you, your apartment is a mess, and your brain just says, hey, remember how your ex used to make you that specific pasta dish and listen to you vent? We need that right now.
And you misinterpret that.
Right. You interpret that sudden, overwhelming wave of longing as empirical proof that you let your soulmate slip away.
When in reality, you just had a really bad day, your prefrontal cortex is offline, and your amygdala is chasing a cheap dopamine hit to regulate your nervous system.
Just realizing that, recognizing the mechanical nature of that craving, has to be the first line of defense against acting on it. It separates the biological urge from a mandate for action.
Exactly. It's about saying, I feel this, but I don't have to obey it.
So if the neurological hardware is this susceptible to emotional hijacking, the software, like our cognitive processing, must be incredibly glitchy too.
Oh, it is full of bugs.
Yeah, the psychological literature points to some severe systemic biases that warp how we measure the timeline of a relationship. Daniel Kahneman's peak-end rule seems to be the dominant force here.
Kahneman's framework is essential. It fundamentally dismantled the idea that human beings function like accountants of their own experiences.
Because we sort of assume we do, right?
We do. We assume we evaluate a relationship by calculating the total sum of our happiness across its duration and then dividing by the number of days to find the average.
The net happiness score.
Right. But the peak-end rule demonstrates that we absolutely do not average our experiences.
How do we judge them?
We judge them almost entirely by two distinct data points. First, the single most intense emotional peak of the experience, and second, the specific emotional texture of its precise conclusion.
The peak and the end. Okay, let's apply this to a hypothetical timeline just to make it concrete.
Let's do it.
You have a 5-year relationship. For roughly 4 years and 10 months, the dynamic is completely mundane. It's just chronic, low-grade dissatisfaction.
The slow drain.
Yeah, the slow drain. You walk on eggshells, the communication is poor, the sex is infrequent, and you feel profoundly unseen. But, it's not explosive.
Right.
Then, the final 2 months descend into absolute chaos. We're talking screaming matches, profound betrayal, slamming doors, and extreme hostility. According to the peak-end rule, the brain doesn't look at the 5 years, does it?
No, it completely ignores the bulk of the time. It takes those 2 months of intense hostility, extrapolates them backwards, and retroactively paints the entire half-decade in the colors of abuse and trauma.
So the final weeks carry this absurd, disproportionate psychological weight.
An incredible amount of weight. If the ending is characterized by hostility, your retrospective assessment will rewrite the mundane years. You won't view the periods of quiet dissatisfaction as natural lulls. You'll view them as evidence of simmering toxicity.
You'll tell yourself you're being deceived the entire time.
Exactly.
But the reverse application of this is equally terrifying, isn't it?
It's actually a huge trap for people.
So say you endure 5 years of high conflict misery, a truly awful relationship. But the actual breakup conversation is handled with intense compassion.
Right, a really mature sit-down.
Yeah. You sit on the floor, you hold hands, you cry, you apologize for your respective failures, and you mutually agree to part ways with profound respect.
The gentle ending dictates the entire summary. Your retrospective assessment softens dramatically.
Because the brain anchors to the compassion of that final conversation.
Yes, it prioritizes it over the half-decade of misery. You will archive the relationship under the category of, a deeply meaningful and loving connection that just didn't work out.
Even if it was horrible. The end overrides the lived reality of the duration.
It's a massive cognitive distortion.
And this operates in tandem with another massive software glitch mentioned in the sources, fading effect bias, or FAB.
Yes, FAB is crucial to understand here.
In a general context, FAB is the psychological mechanism where negative emotions attached to an event degrade and dissipate much faster than the positive emotions attached to the same event.
And we should note, FAB is generally an evolutionary triumph.
How so?
Well, if the acute, visceral terror of a traumatic event never faded, humans would be paralyzed. If the physical agony of childbirth remained as vivid 10 years later as it was in the delivery room, birth rates would plummet.
That makes total sense. We require the negative affect to fade so we can maintain psychological momentum and just continue engaging with the dangerous world.
We have to forget the pain to keep going.
But when applied to a breakup, that survival mechanism becomes a massive trap.
It completely turns on us.
Because in the immediate aftermath, the negative affect is incredibly high. You are furious. You replay their betrayals on a loop. And that anger is highly functional, right? It acts as an electric fence, keeping you away from someone who hurt you.
Anger is a brilliant boundary-setting emotion. But as the months pass, the long-term phase of FAB initiates.
The fading begins.
Exactly. The visceral sting of the betrayal, the suffocating feeling of the arguments, the exhaustion of the incompatibility, all of that negative affect naturally degrades.
While the positive stuff stays.
Yes. Simultaneously, the warm, positive feelings attached to the idealized peaks of the relationship retain their full saturation.
So you get this asymmetrical fading.
Which induces what clinicians refer to as relationship amnesia.
Relationship amnesia. So you wake up a year later, the electric fence of your anger is totally gone, and you think, was it actually that bad? Maybe I was too demanding. Maybe we could make it work now.
You mistake the biological decay of your anger for a genuine shift in the relationship's viability.
Which is so dangerous.
Yeah.
And if you add the sunk cost fallacy to that, it's honestly a miracle anyone ever permanently leaves a bad dynamic.
Oh, the sunk cost fallacy is incredibly powerful in romance. The application of economic principles to emotional investment is incredibly precise.
So how does it warp our memory?
Well, the sunk cost fallacy demonstrates that the more resources, whether that's time, emotional labor, financial integration, or social capital, that an individual pours into a dynamic, the more fiercely they will resist abandoning it.
Even when they know it's failing.
Even when the data clearly indicates the endeavor is totally bankrupt. Because acknowledging that, say, a 7-year relationship is fundamentally broken requires a massive confrontation with ego injury.
Right, you have to admit you spent 7 years building a house on a cracked foundation.
And the ego hates that. So to avoid the psychological devastation of that admission, the mind distorts the past. It artificially inflates the value of the good times to balance the ledger.
You convince yourself the foundation isn't cracked. It just needs a fresh coat of paint. Just to justify the immense expenditure of your life.
Exact.
And historically, eventually, time and distance would do their job, right?
Yeah.
You would move on because you simply wouldn't interact with the person. But the digital age has thrown a huge wrench into the machinery of FAB.
The social media trap.
Yes, the source data on the social media trap is definitive. We are literally carrying our ghosts in our pockets.
Digital surveillance actively sabotages the brain's natural healing protocols.
How bad is it?
Well, if FAB is the necessary process of an emotional wound scabbing over and healing because the painful stimuli have been removed, checking an ex-partner's social media is the equivalent of continuously ripping the scab off.
Ouch.
The research indicates that visual exposure to an ex-partner's curated, updated life forces the brain's distress networks to remain in an activated state.
Because you aren't just remembering the past anymore. You are continuously injecting new data into this system. You see them at a coffee shop you've never been to, wearing a shirt you've never seen, maybe sitting across from someone new.
And your brain frantically tries to reconcile your current state of loss with their perceived state of progression.
Which is just a recipe for endless anxiety.
Yeah.
What does the data say about the outcomes here?
The statistical outcomes are grim. Individuals who engage in ongoing digital surveillance of a former partner prolong their psychological recovery phase by a factor of up to 3 times.
3 times as long.
Yes, compared to cohorts who enforce strict digital detachment. They artificially trap themselves in the acute phase of grief for years, completely overriding their own biological fading mechanisms.
Wow. So you're just holding your hand on the hot stove and wondering why the burn isn't healing.
It's self-inflicted torture, neurologically speaking.
It really makes you wonder how these abstract biases, peak end, FAB, sunk cost, manifest in a highly analytical mind. Because a common defense I hear is, well, I am a logical person. I don't let emotions dictate my reality. I process data.
Which is a very common illusion.
Right. And the sources provide a granular case study that utterly dismantles the illusion of the objective, logical observer. Let's look at Marcus, the engineer's postmortem paradox.
Marcus is a perfect example of this. So he is a 34-year-old lead systems engineer. His entire cognitive framework is built on algorithmic logic.
He's a data guy?
Exactly. At work, if a complex software architecture fails, he initiates a root cause analysis. He isolates the variables, identifies the bug, deploys a patch, and the system functions.
Makes sense for his job.
Yes, but he approaches his 4-year relationship with his partner, Elena, using the exact same paradigm.
What human relationships are not software.
No, they are not. So Elena initiates the breakup, and her stated reasons are deeply frustrating to an engineer. She cites chronic emotional unavailability, a feeling of profound unseeness, and a divergence in their long-term visions.
So there is no catastrophic event.
Yeah.
No infidelity, no massive screaming match. The structure just quietly collapsed under the weight of emotional neglect.
Right. And for a mind structured like Marcus's, ambiguity is intolerable. The psyche demands a coherent, linear narrative to process the loss. So Marcus enters what we call phase 1, intellectualization.
How does that look for him?
He rejects Elena's abstract explanations and attempts to quantify the failure. He obsessively mines their digital history. He's reviewing text message cadence, calendar invites, and literally logging the frequency of their disagreements.
He is searching for the specific line of faulty code that broke the relationship.
Yes. He is using data to build a fortress against the pain of rejection.
And because he is in the immediate aftermath, the end portion of the Pecan rule completely dominates his analysis. The breakup discussions were tense and cold, so he retroactively maps that tension onto the entire 4 years.
He builds a comprehensive narrative portraying Elena as erratic, demanding, and incapable of logical communication.
So he successfully convinces himself that the breakup was just an inevitable, necessary systems purge.
Yes, and that intellectualization serves a critical protective function for his ego. If the system failed because her parameters were irrational, then her departure is not a reflection of his intrinsic worth.
Oh, wow. So he doesn't have to face the agonizing reality that his own emotional limitations drove away a partner he valued.
Yeah.
He secures his ego completely behind a wall of data.
Exactly, but biology doesn't care about your data wall.
Right, because 6 months later, Marcus enters phase 2. The software bugs hit.
Yes, fading effect bias begins to erode the sharp anger and all those defensive justifications. The stress of the final months fades.
And suddenly, his neurobiology starts serving up intense, high-definition memories of the early years. The quiet mornings, drinking coffee in silence, the deep intellectual rhythm they shared when analyzing books, that profound baseline of trust.
But lacking a foundation in cognitive psychology, Marcus applies his engineering logic to this new biological shift.
Which is a disaster.
Total disaster. He observes his current internal state. He feels intense warmth, longing, and zero anger. He reasons that since his current emotional data points are universally positive, his initial postmortem analysis must have been flawed.
So he concludes, with terrifying logical certainty, that Elena is his singular soulmate, and he has committed a catastrophic error.
Yes, he takes the byproduct of a biological fading mechanism and treats it as empirical truth.
He totally ignores the reality that she felt chronically abandoned while sitting right next to him on the couch. Logic built the trap, so logic cannot dismantle it. So how does an analytical mind survive that paradox?
He eventually has to enter phase 3, mindful integration. Marcus had to surrender his algorithmic framework. He had to actually learn the neuroscience of his own mind.
He had to realize his brain was playing tricks on him.
Right, recognizing that his sudden intense longing was not a transmission of objective truth, but merely his amygdala reacting to current feelings of isolation by retrieving peak romantic memories.
So he had to deliberately force his cognitive architecture to hold two opposing realities simultaneously.
Exactly. He had to build the dual ledger. Reality A. The intellectual connection was exceptionally beautiful and the love was genuine. Reality B. The emotional structure of the dynamic was entirely unsustainable for her needs, and his limitations were real.
Holding both realities without trying to resolve one into the other is basically the essence of psychological integration. He didn't need to find the bug to fix the system. He just needed to accept that the system was permanently archived.
Marcus's struggle is a high-resolution portrait of a universal need. We are all desperate for a narrative framing that makes sense of the loss.
And the narrative we build depends almost entirely on our position in the blast radius, right? The sources delve deeply into the psychological defenses mobilized by the initiator versus the non-initiator of the breakup.
Yes, because everyone is trying to preserve their self-worth, but the threats they face are entirely different.
Let's start with the non-initiator.
The non-initiator, the partner who is left behind, faces the ultimate psychological threat, the terrifying implication of unlovability and abandonment.
Which is huge.
It's massive. The ego simply cannot tolerate that level of exposure. So to shield against it, the non-initiator psyche often aggressively fixates on the flaws of the departing partner. The narrative is heavily skewed toward vilification.
The internal monologue insists they were incapable of true intimacy, they are avoidant, they are selfish.
It's a defensive armor. If you convince yourself they were uniquely broken, you don't have to confront the possibility that you are lacking.
But the initiator has a completely different cross to bear. They aren't battling rejection, they are drowning in guilt.
The initiator carries the profound moral weight of having inflicted deep pain on someone they once cherished. And guilt is an incredibly heavy cognitive burden.
So how do they cope?
To alleviate that burden, the initiator's narrative hyper-focuses on the fatalistic inevitability of the split. They amplify the incompatibilities until they become insurmountable mountains.
The narrative becomes, I had absolutely no choice. Staying would have destroyed my soul and eventually theirs. I did the merciful thing.
Exactly. Both people externalize the fault to survive the transition.
It creates this binary cinematic mythology where you are either the tragic victim or the reluctant hero. But that rigid framing inevitably fractures, leading to this wild oscillation in the grieving process. You don't just pick a narrative and stick with it.
No, the nonlinear nature of grief is deeply destabilizing. The psyche oscillates violently between outward defensive projection, which manifests as searing anger toward the ex-partner, and inward rumination, which manifests as profound guilt, self-flagellation, and obsessing over perceived personal failures. It's a pendulum.
Yeah.
Monday, you are furious at their selfishness. Wednesday, you are paralyzed by the thought that your own anxiety ruined the best dynamic you ever had.
And while you are swinging wildly on that pendulum, cultural programming whispers this toxic promise in your ear.
The myth of external closure.
Yes. The idea that if you just secure one final meeting, one last cup of coffee where you look them in the eye and ask why, they will deliver a perfectly articulated, honest accounting of the relationship's demise.
You will receive the final puzzle piece, and you will walk away healed.
Which is a complete fantasy. The narrative integration model systematically destroys the utility of external closure. Relying on an ex-partner for closure is a fundamental strategic error.
Why is it such a bad idea?
Because you are approaching an individual who is currently bound by their own memory distortions, their own fading effect bias, their own guilt, and their own defensive narrative framing.
You are asking someone whose memory is actively mutating to validate your mutating memory. It's like two people with broken compasses trying to draw a map together. That's exactly it. They don't have the objective truth either. They are going to tell you the version of the story their ego needs them to tell.
Which will likely just inflict new wounds or deepen the confusion.
True closure is an entirely internal mechanism. It is the act of autonomous narrative construction. It occurs when you stop demanding external validation for your pain, accept the inherent ambiguity of the separation, and author a cohesive internal understanding of what the experience meant for your own trajectory.
The speed at which people arrive at that internal closure seems to vary wildly, though. And if you look at the cultural zeitgeist, especially short-form content like TikTok, the narrative is overwhelmingly gendered.
Very heavily gendered.
The pervasive trope is that women experience immediate, devastating grief, but process it quickly and move on, while men celebrate their freedom for a month, suppress the loss, and then experience a delayed year-long depression.
It's a very popular story.
But the data in our sources tells a vastly different story.
Right. Yes, the empirical longitudinal survey data shatters the pop psychology and gender binary. When researchers measure the ultimate depth, intensity, and duration of psychological distress following a significant romantic rupture, the scores between male and female cohorts are virtually indistinguishable.
So the capacity for profound relational suffering is universally human.
Completely universal.
If the baseline pain is identical, why does the cultural observation look so different?
The divergence lies entirely in socially conditioned processing timelines and acceptable coping mechanisms. Statistically, female cohorts are socially permitted and encouraged to seek immediate communal support.
They talk about it.
Exactly. They engage in explicit emotional processing at the onset of the rupture. They articulate the loss, analyze the dynamics with peer groups, and externalize the grief. This active engagement facilitates faster neurological integration of the trauma.
Meanwhile, male cohorts are subject to rigid social conditioning that equates explicit emotional processing with weakness.
Right. They frequently default to distraction, stoicism, or behavioral suppression. They throw themselves into high-intensity work, hyper-socialize, or immediately re-enter the dating pool.
They attempt to outrun the neurological mandate to process the loss. But suppressed grief does not dissipate. It ferments.
It absolutely ferments. Months later, when the distraction mechanisms fail or exhaustion sets in, the unprocessed emotional backlog breaches the surface, resulting in severe, lingering distress long after the partner who processed the grief explicitly has integrated the experience.
But the sources are clear that gender is ultimately the superficial lens for this. If you want the actual source code dictating how a person navigates a breakup, you have to look at attachment theory.
Attachment theory is the real key here.
The deep-seated relational blueprints formed in early development entirely dictate the post-breakup reality. Let's examine the baseline first. Secure attachment.
A securely attached individual approaches relationships with a coherent, internalized sense of self-worth that is independent of their relational status.
So when a rupture occurs, how do they handle it?
They process the pain directly. They do not need to employ severe defensive projections to survive the ego injury. They possess the psychological bandwidth to hold a holistic, nuanced view of the relationship.
They can acknowledge their partner's wonderful qualities without minimizing the fundamental incompatibilities that necessitated the split.
Right. They allow the memories to age naturally into integrated life lessons without idealizing or vilifying.
They sound incredibly well-adjusted, which is obviously the goal. But it is a stark contrast to the anxious attachment experience, which sounds like an absolute neurological nightmare.
It is incredibly painful. For an anxiously attached individual, the primary operating system is hypervigilance regarding abandonment. A breakup is not merely a loss. It is the realization of their core existential terror.
So upon separation, their attachment system goes into massive hyperactivation. They experience profound, agonizing distress.
And the cognitive biases hit them differently, too. They almost instantly begin to idealize the former partner, weaponizing the peak end rule against themselves.
They replay the moments of disconnection on a loop, convincing themselves they have squandered their only opportunity for love. And their fading effect bias is broken in a very specific way, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The negative affect directed inward refuses to fade. Their core fear of unworthiness drives them to shoulder the entire blame for the structural failure.
Their internal narrative becomes this relentless cycle of self-flagellation. If I hadn't been so needy, if I had just been more accommodating, they wouldn't have left.
They idolize the partner and demonize themselves, creating a paralyzing cycle of persistent longing.
Then you have the absolute inverse response, avoidant attachment. These individuals utilize deactivating strategies to manage the vulnerability of intimacy. So when a breakup happens, their immediate biological response isn't panic, it's relief.
Which is very confusing for their partners. They perceive the removal of emotional demands as a restoration of safety. They rapidly assert their independence, heavily compartmentalize the relational history, and basically shut down the conscious attachment system.
They present as hyperfunctional and entirely unaffected.
But the neurobiology of memory cannot be permanently deactivated. The grief is simply placed in a pressurized container in the basement.
And that container inevitably ruptures. Avoidantly attached individuals are uniquely susceptible to severely delayed emotional tsunamis.
Yes. Months or sometimes years later, when their defensive posture is fully relaxed, because there is no immediate threat of intimacy, a minor environmental trigger can bypass their conscious control.
The suppressed romantic memories flood their system entirely out of context, leading to intense, disorienting nostalgia for the partner they pushed away.
Now, the classical view of these attachment styles was profoundly deterministic. If you were formed anxious, you die anxious. But the current consensus in relational neuroscience is shifting dramatically.
Which is such good news. What's the modern view?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we find a profound evolution in the field, moving from static blueprints to dynamic fluidity. Modern neuroscience emphasizes neuroplasticity.
So they aren't permanent traits.
Exactly. Attachment styles are not permanent genetic traits. They are highly fluid, context-dependent adaptations. An individual might operate securely in one dynamic, but a highly avoidant partner can trigger latent anxious responses.
More importantly, through deliberate mindfulness, somatic regulation, and consistent therapeutic practice, individuals can actually rewire their neural pathways to achieve what clinicians call earned security.
Post-breakup processing is a learned skill, not a life sentence.
Yeah, that concept of dynamic fluidity is incredibly hopeful. But to really grasp how powerful these attachment blueprints are when they remain unconscious, the sources provide a brilliant case study of an anxious avoidant loop.
This Sarah and David case study.
Yeah, we see how two people can cohabitate in the exact same relationship, but experience entirely different realities, both during and after the partnership. Walk us through Sarah and David.
Sarah and David are a classic illustration of the demand-withdrawal cycle. Sarah operates with an anxious attachment style. She requires high levels of verbal reassurance and consistent physical proximity to regulate her nervous system.
And David?
David operates with an avoidant attachment style. He requires significant autonomy and physical space to regulate his. For 2 years, they trigger each other perfectly.
Sarah's attempts to close the distance feel like suffocation to David. David's attempts to secure space feel like abandonment to Sarah. The tension reaches a breaking point, and David initiates the breakup.
So let's look at Sarah's immediate aftermath. It is total systemic panic. She is the anxious partner realizing her worst fear.
Her brain, desperate to reestablish the severed bond, fixates entirely on the peak moments from their first 3 months of dating, the honeymoon phase, when David was fully present.
She loops those memories endlessly, but the most dangerous cognitive distortion is how she interprets her own suffering.
What does she do?
She conflates the intensity of her pain with the depth of her love. Because the withdrawal is so agonizing, she retroactively assumes the relationship must have been spectacularly valuable.
Oh, she is completely erasing the objective reality of the last year and a half. She is ignoring the fact that while they were actually together, she was chronically anxious, perpetually monitoring his moods, crying in the bathroom, and feeling profoundly alone while lying next to him in bed.
She was deeply unhappy in the relationship, but the breakup tricks her into believing she lost a perfect dynamic.
Now, flip the perspective to David, the delayed tsunami.
Right. Upon ending the relationship, David experiences a profound wave of calm. His avoidant defenses validate his decision. He tells himself Sarah was simply too demanding, and he is fundamentally unsuited for partnership.
He immerses himself entirely in a major professional project. For 8 months, he operates with high efficiency and zero conscious regret. He has successfully compartmentalized the relationship.
But the container in the basement is under pressure. 8 months go by. The immediate threat of Sarah's emotional demands is completely gone. His nervous system is baseline. And then he is cleaning out a hard drive and finds a candid photo of Sarah laughing during a road trip they took. The visual cue completely bypasses his lowered defenses.
The emotional floodgates fail completely. The suppressed grief, the genuine affection he held for her, and the warmth of her devotion hit his conscious mind with hurricane force.
Because he is safely distant from the actual demands of the relationship, his fading affect bias goes into overdrive. He remembers her warmth, her smile, the safety of being loved by her.
And just like Sarah ignored her chronic anxiety, David completely forgets the suffocating claustrophobia, the endless arguments about his text response times, and the overwhelming pressure that forced him to leave.
They are both trapped in the exact same illusion, just operating on staggered timelines. Sarah idealized from a position of immediate, hyperactivated terror. David romanticized from a position of distant, safe nostalgia.
And if they do not recognize this as a biological glitch, they might attempt to reconcile based on these phantom memories, only to immediately recreate the exact same demand-withdrawal cycle the moment proximity is reestablished.
True healing demands that Sarah recognizes her longing is driven by a fear of isolation, not David's perfection. And David must learn to process the vulnerability of connection in real time, rather than only feeling safe enough to experience love 8 months after he has fled.
Seeing how easily our brains construct these phantom realities begs a massive philosophical question. If our memories are continuously distorted by cognitive load, FAB, peak-end biases, and attachment triggers, is looking back inherently dangerous?
The psychological community is actually deeply fractured on the value of nostalgia.
It is a fierce debate between the pro-nostalgia camp, which views the phenomenon as highly adaptive, and the clinical counterview, which warns of its pathological potential.
Let's start with the adaptive argument, because it makes sense on a structural level.
Right. Prominent researchers argue that nostalgia is an evolved psychological resource. When an individual is experiencing acute existential drift, severe loneliness, or a period of profound present-day failure, nostalgic reflection acts as a stabilizing anchor.
Even if the memory of the ex-partner is somewhat romanticized, engaging with that memory reminds the nervous system that the individual is capable of profound connection, of being desired, and of loving deeply.
It fortifies self-esteem and boosts psychological resilience when the present is barren.
The argument is that nostalgia is a psychological shock absorber. However, the clinical counterview is far more cautious. Therapists warn that unexamined nostalgia, particularly when heavily subsidized by fading affect bias, easily metastasizes into a state of limerence.
Limerence, what is that exactly?
It's an obsessive, chronic fixation on an idealized past. You are no longer remembering a human being. You have constructed a flawless Phantom X.
And that Phantom X becomes a weapon you use against your own future. If you anchor your emotional baseline to an edited, perfected fiction, no real, flawed, complex human being standing in front of you today can possibly compete.
Exactly. You go on dates, and because the new person isn't as perfect as the ghost of your ex, you reject them.
Nostalgia stops being a shock absorber and becomes an addictive anesthetic that prevents you from participating in reality.
You substitute the terrifying vulnerability of a real, developing relationship with the safe, controlled, static fantasy of the past.
I want to debate the mechanics of that reality, though. If fading affect bias naturally softens the painful memories to protect our sanity and help us move forward, does actively fighting that bias cause harm?
That's a really common question.
Because if I know I'm romanticizing an ex and I force myself to sit down and visualize all the cruel, dismissive things they did to break the limerence, am I just re-traumatizing myself? Is it even possible to achieve an objective memory? Or is the goal just to find the most functional fiction?
Well, the goal is never absolute, sterile objectivity. Human beings are meaning-making creatures, not surveillance cameras. But forcing yourself to recall the negative aspects is not re-traumatization if done correctly. It is the pursuit of integration.
Integration?
Yes. You are not trying to replace a positive fiction with a negative fiction. You are attempting to ground yourself when the balloon of fantasy threatens to carry you away from reality.
But how do you distinguish between genuine, integrated intuition, looking back and calmly realizing that dynamic lacked the communication I require, and defensive rationalization, where you are just aggressively villainizing them to avoid feeling your own grief and guilt?
The distinction lies entirely in the somatic and emotional texture of the memory. Defensive rationalization feels frantic, rigid, and binary. It is saturated with anger, self-righteousness, or a desperate need to prove superiority.
It relies heavily on the victim-villain dichotomy.
Right. Genuine integrated intuition, on the other hand, feels heavy, grounded, and somber. It invariably includes a degree of personal accountability.
So it sounds less like they were a narcissist who destroyed me and more like they were fundamentally incapable of meeting my needs, and I failed myself by staying for 3 years hoping they would change.
Exactly. Integration holds space for the complexity of mutual failure.
So, if we accept that our brains are going to hit us with FAB, manipulate us with the peak end rule, and trigger our attachment anxieties, how do we actively outsmart our own neurobiology?
This is where we get to the practical application.
Right, the source material details 3 highly actionable frameworks for emotional release. When you're sitting in the dark at 2 a.m., feeling that overwhelming urge to text your ex, what is the protocol? The first framework is the direct countermeasure to the cognitive distortions. The dual ledger reality check.
The dual ledger is a profound exercise in enforcing cognitive dissonance until integration is achieved. When the wave of nostalgia hits and your brain is exclusively broadcasting the highlight reel, you physically write out 2 side-by-side ledgers.
Ledger A is the authentic highs.
Yes. You meticulously list the genuine moments of profound connection, the shared laughter, the periods of undeniable support. You do not diminish the beauty of what existed. You validate your own lived experience.
You look at Ledger A and say, the trip to the coast was magical. They supported me beautifully when I lost my job. You honor the reality of the joy.
Exactly, but immediately adjacent, you write Ledger B, the structural incompatibilities. Here you list the chronic, unresolvable friction points, the fundamentally misaligned values regarding family or finances.
The recurring communication breakdowns where you felt entirely dismissed. The specific logistical and emotional reasons. The dynamic was unsustainable.
The power of this is that it forces the brain out of binary processing. You cannot villainize them because Ledger A proves there was beauty. You cannot idealize them because Ledger B proves the structure was lethal.
You achieve an integrated reality. It was a profoundly beautiful chapter, and it ran its natural, necessary course. The second framework builds on this by employing mindfulness, decoupling emotion from action.
This requires developing an observer mind. It is the practice of experiencing a powerful emotional wave without confusing it for a mandate to act.
When the memory hits, instead of reaching for the phone to check their Instagram, you verbally name the biological mechanism.
Literally say it out loud. Say, I am currently experiencing fading affect bias. My prefrontal cortex is depleted because I am exhausted, and my amygdala is recalling a peak romantic memory to soothe my nervous system.
By identifying the mechanism, you strip the emotion of its mystical authority. It is no longer a cosmic sign that you belong together. It is merely a predictable neurochemical event triggered by a drop in blood sugar or a stressful day at the office.
You observe the sensation with detached curiosity, allow the physiological wave to crest and dissipate, and actively refrain from converting the emotion into a behavioral compulsion.
Which leads directly to the final, most crucial framework, constructing an internal closure narrative. We've established that seeking answers from the ex-partner is a fool's errand. You must author the closure yourself.
The text outlines 3 vital pillars of self-inquiry to build that narrative. It requires shifting the analytical spotlight completely away from the ex-partner and focusing it entirely on self-authorship.
What are the 3 questions?
First, what specific, actionable data did this relationship provide regarding my own hidden relational patterns, my boundaries, and my attachment triggers? Second, what unexpected resilience, strengths, or insights did I discover within myself through the agonizing process of enduring the separation?
And third, how will I actively apply these insights to show up with greater authenticity, security, and clarity in my future trajectory?
You completely strip them of their role as the main character in your pain. You convert the entire relationship, including the devastation of its ending, into raw data for your own future evolution. You reclaim your agency.
This has been an incredibly expansive journey through the architecture of memory. We started with the physical, protein-synthesizing reality of reconsolidation and the literal somatic pain registered in the brain's cortex.
We covered a lot of ground today.
We really did. We mapped the cognitive minefields of the peak-end rule and FAB, explored the deep, fluid blueprints of attachment theory with Marcus, Sarah, and David, and finally established the actual frameworks required to rewire our historical narratives.
The undeniable takeaway is that letting go of the past isn't about forgetting. It is about surrendering the desperate need for an objective, perfect history so that we can construct a secure, integrated present.
Remembering an ex is an active, emotionally driven construction project, occurring entirely in the present moment. And if we deeply internalize the neuroscience we've explored today, it leaves the listener with a profound, paradigm-altering realization.
And that final thought is this. If your memory of an ex is continuously rewritten by your current emotional state, then your lingering, painful nostalgia is not actually a documentary about who your ex was. It is a mirror, reflecting exactly what you are starving for right now in your own life.
So when the ache hits and you miss them,
Yeah.
what are you actually missing within yourself? Are you truly missing the reality of that specific person, or are you just missing the feeling of being fundamentally safe?
Are you missing them, or are you missing the sensation of being chosen, of being seen, of having your future feel predictable?
That is the ultimate question to sit with. The next time you are driving on a random Tuesday, the song plays and the ghost of the past violently hijacks your nervous system. Remember, the X-ray machine is broken. The memory isn't real. But the opportunity to discover what you are desperately hungry for right now in the present, that is profoundly real. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.